Hi, I'm Saskia Kamerling, and this is going to be an analysis of Cat's Cradle by Vonnegut, mostly diving into the themes of philosophy and religion which are present in the book, and are present in most of his works. It's part of what makes Vonnegut Vonnegut. But before I get started, I just want to preface, number one, I think everyone should read Cat's Cradle. It's an amazing story. It has a lot to say about the world and comes together in a really magical narrative. So unless you're the person who is required to grade me on this, I would say this video is not going to be well produced enough for it to be worth spoiling this amazing book over. So that's my first preface. And secondly, I want to say it's important that I say thank you to my father for encouraging me to read this book in the first place when I was 14 and we were on a family vacation, because there's something so special about being a young person on an airplane heading to an island in the Caribbean and reading this book about people who go to an island in the Caribbean and accidentally bring about the end of the world. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to, now that I'm older, go back to this story that I loved so much then and dive deeper and give it the analysis that it deserves, because, you know, we like things when we're 14, but we don't really understand them on the same level that we can when we're older. So now that I have had some more life experience, I am extremely excited to share with you my perspective on Cat's Cradle at this point in my life and everything that I got out of it. So I hope you enjoy. Okay, before I get into my analysis, let me just do a quick plot summary. It won't be long, I promise. So our narrator, Jonah, which, let me preface that on the first page of the novel, the narrator says, "Call me Jonah," but then continues to elaborate that his name is actually John, and yet, interestingly, throughout the rest of the story, he's not referred to by any name after that first page when those two names come up. So his name is up for debate, I guess, but I'm just going to call him Jonah for the sake of not referring to him as narrator the entire time. But so Jonah is a journalist looking to write a novel titled The Day the World Ended, which will detail the lives of Americans the day of the bombing of Hiroshima, most importantly focusing on scientist Felix Honecker, one of the fathers of the atomic bomb. In his research, Jonah's life becomes entangled with those of the three Honecker children. The oldest, Angela, who became the matriarch of the Honecker family after their mother's untimely death, now struggles to find fulfillment in her own life after her father has also passed away. Franklin, the middle child, has been missing for years and is presumed to be dead, and Newt, the baby of the family, has dwarfism and, as of the start of the novel, has recently flunked out of college. Jonah learns, through the Honecker children's insights on their father's work, that after developing the atomic bomb, Dr. Honecker's primary passion up until his death had been the development of Ice-9, a material which could instantly freeze any liquid it touches, and, if misused, has the potential to freeze all the water on Earth and bring about the end of the world. Eventually it comes to the public's attention that the missing Honecker son, Frank, is in fact alive and living on a small island in the Caribbean called San Lorenzo, where he works as the second-in-command and chief scientist to the country's president, a man named Papa Monzano. So Jonah, accompanied by Angela and Newton, as well as a cast of other characters, ventures to the island of San Lorenzo to meet Franklin. And on the island, Jonah is introduced to the teachings of Bokononism, a religion created by a local fugitive named Bokonon, which paradoxically is both practiced by everyone on the island and considered illegal and punishable by death by the San Lorenzo government. This fictional religion, Bokononism, is what interests me and many other readers most about Cat's Cradle. Within the text, Bokononism is founded by the character Bokonon, a reluctant globetrotter once named Lionel Boyd Johnson. Johnson was raised an Episcopalian in Tobago, was educated in London, served in World War I, and at one point even spent years as a follower of Gandhi in India, all of which served as influences for his teachings in the books of Bokonon. Johnson took the name Bokonon after he and his comrade, a military deserter named Earl McCabe, washed up on a small island in the Caribbean as the lone survivors of a shipwreck, a trauma which also is a notable influence in Bokonon's teachings. Interestingly, Cat's Cradle is far from Vonnegut's only work to feature faith as a major theme. It's not even the only one to come with a fully fleshed out in-text religion. Vonnegut's family legacy was a long line of free thinkers, and he himself was an atheist, but, as Dan Wakefield said in his essay on Vonnegut, despite his free-thinking humanist views, no other major American novelist of the post-war era expressed such a fascination with Jesus, nor referred to him as often in his work, both fiction and nonfiction, as Vonnegut. Vonnegut vocally opposed and mocked organized religion for its many pitfalls and would not allow himself under any circumstances to be called a Christian, yet he remained, in his own words, a Christ-loving atheist. It's interesting to view Bokononism in Cat's Cradle by observing the character who created it, Bokonon, and it's also just as valuable to see it as the product of the man behind the character, Vonnegut himself. And by analyzing the core beliefs of Bokononism, which we can glean from the text, we seem to unlock a belief system built out of Christianity, world cultures, and the greatest thinkers in Western philosophy. A religion created by an atheist sounds like a paradox, and yet Vonnegut manages to create a theology which is morally sound, innovative, and most importantly, appealing to readers. So how does that work? Don't be a fool. Close this book at once. It's nothing but FOMA. This is the warning our narrator finds on the title page of the books of Bokonon. FOMA, Bokonon tells us, are harmless untruths, or the lies which make us brave and kind and healthy and happy. This concept of FOMA is repeated multiple times in the narrative of Cat's Cradle, and it intrigues the reader every time it comes up because it creates dissonance in our minds between our socially ingrained belief that lying is wrong and an insistence by the text that lies, FOMA, are beneficial and necessary to us. This assertion that the teachings of this religion are founded on lies is the first thing you would see upon opening a copy of the books of Bokonon, and through that frankness, Bokonon, and therefore Vonnegut, critiques traditional organized religions as liars too, so utterly dishonest, in fact, that they won't even admit it to themselves. All religions are lying to you, he seems to say, but only this one will be honest about it. Only an atheist like Vonnegut, or, within the narrative, a man like Bokonon, who has lost everything in a shipwreck and has become cynical about society, could begin a holy text like this. Because it seems that in trying to solve the problem religion lies to us, a believer might seek out more truth, more certainty of faith. But Vonnegut concludes that if we don't know something for sure, all we can do is be upfront about that uncertainty. And in Bokonon's case, this honesty works in bringing peace to the citizens of San Lorenzo. Bokononism appeals to the skeptical or the cynical Christian because it requires faith, but not the blind variety, and instead encourages its followers to accept the unknown and embrace the dissonance. As the character Julian Castle, himself a Bokononist, says about the people of San Lorenzo, people didn't have to pay so much attention to the awful truth. They were all employed full-time as actors in a play that they understood, that any human being anywhere could understand and applaud. Another motif of Bokonon's teachings, which I'll touch on briefly, is the relationships we form in our lives. One of the first introductions we get to Bokononism comes in chapter 1, when Jonah says, Bokononists believe that humanity is organized into teams that do God's will without ever discovering what they're doing. Such a team is referred to as a karass. One's karass is hard to identify, as its members are just as likely to be a lifelong companion as they are a stranger you run into only once, and it operates under complete equality, as a karass ignores national, institutional, occupational, familial, and class boundaries. A quick sidebar, the opposite of a karass is something known as a granfalloon, which for the sake of this analysis is not super relevant, but I'll quickly define it as a group of people unified by a superficial similarity. The most used example in the text is the commonality of our narrator and many other characters being from Indiana and treating being Hoosiers as if it's something genuine that unites them. Granfalloons are one of the most interesting and popular concepts that Vonnegut gives us in the book, so I beg of you, read Cat's Cradle and then tell me that you don't start seeing granfalloons everywhere, because they are so prevalent in our society and it's very fun to be able to spot them. The karass is seemingly an offshoot of Bokonon's firm belief in faith, and as Jonah says, your karass is intended to do God's will without ever knowing it, or without even knowing that you found your karass at all. Yet Jonah consistently informs the audience every time we meet a new character whether or not they are a member of his own karass, and never once does he seem to doubt that he knows for a fact who is or isn't a part of God's plan for him. This again is a contradiction, not too surprising when looking at anything Bokononistic, and seems to lead us towards the conclusion that whether or not he's right in identifying the members of his karass, Jonah finds it spiritually valuable to evaluate the relationships in his life and see who's really important to him in the long run. And it's sort of beautiful, this idea that while the characters are following God's plan and who they encounter in life is completely up to fate, which relationships they value most are actually of their own choosing. And speaking of God's unknowable plans, Bokononists very strongly believe in fate, like with one's cuirass, and we're never meant to know our fate, at least not until it's already done. And Vonnegut makes sure to build fate into the narrative. For example, there's a prophecy in the books of Bokonon that states, "The golden boat will sail again when the end of the world is near." The golden boat referring to the lifeboat which originally brought Bokonon to San Lorenzo. And without getting into too many details as to how the book ends, this prophecy does come true by the conclusion of Cat's Cradle. It's important to recognize that Bokonon's prediction for the end of the world is correct, because Jonah is very adamant in telling the audience that no one can ever know God's plan, and anyone who claims to is the greatest kind of fool. Therefore, Bokonon belatedly earns his place as the head of this theology by being the only character we see who is able to see beyond the veil and predict God's will. But I have a lot more to say on this idea of fate and free will in Bokononism a little later, so for now, let's just discuss the last major theme I found in the books of Bokonon. Vonnegut writes the characters of Felix Honecker and Asa Breed, Dr. Honecker's supervisor at the General Forge and Foundry Company, as men of science, standing in direct opposition to men of faith like our narrator. Dr. Breed, in particular, is aggressive in his resentment of the preternatural, stating that the trouble with the world was that people were still superstitious instead of scientific, and that if everyone would study science more, there wouldn't be all the trouble there was. Doctors Honecker and Breed are not Bokononists. Jonah even notes interestingly that Dr. Breed dislikes him instantly upon their first meeting, as if, despite Jonah not being a Bokononist or even a very devout Christian at this point in the story, Dr. Breed can sense that their fates will guide them in completely opposite directions. Dr. Breed would, of course, deny this. He doesn't believe in fate. But by establishing this scientific, skeptical perspective early, Vonnegut is able to create some great parallels later as Jonah does find his faith in San Lorenzo and more tenets of Bokononism are revealed to the audience. Bokononism is made clear to be a religion disinterested in negotiating between science and faith, as many religions in real life try to do. As we've already discussed with the concept of FOMA, building a doctrine which is openly founded on lies allows Bokononism the freedom to take faith to the extreme, belief with no need for justification, and promises with no need for guilt. In chapter 104, when explaining the core beliefs of Bokononism to some Americans, Frank Honecker says plainly, he's against science. Much of the philosophy that came out of the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment was interested in the state of nature and how to overcome what was thought to be the savage state humans would live in without the structure of society, religion, or government to guide us. Philosophy is certainly something that the character of Bokonon would have been well educated on, as he attended university in London in 1911, and this shows in Cat's Cradle. For example, in chapter 79, the character Julian Castle says, when referring to the government of San Lorenzo, McCabe and Bokonon did not succeed in raising what is generally thought of as the standard of living. The truth was that life was as short and brutish and mean as ever. Clearly, this is a reference to Thomas Hobbes' famous assertion that in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But Bokonon does not lament that his religion has failed to lift his people out of the state of nature, and he instead concludes that if this nasty, brutish life is what we're given by nature, by God, then wouldn't that be the life that we're supposed to live? Bokonon suffered the worst consequences of modern civilization. He fought in the Great War and was held prisoner on a German submarine. He illegally immigrated into the United States. He witnessed the British oppression of India on the brink of their independence movement, just to name a few. And so when he finally washes up on an island where the people are not shackled by the problems of politics, he embraces this new life. Through his background navigating through what was considered the height of human society, Bokonon was able to build a religion in opposition to all of the suffering he'd witnessed, and create a government which accepts the worst of human nature, because, as Bokonon warns us, beware of the man who works hard to learn something, learns it, and finds himself no wiser than before. He is full of murderous resentment for the people who are ignorant, without having come by their ignorance the hard way. The central beliefs of Bokononism which I've presented are just my interpretation, after collecting and analyzing as much in-text information about Bokononism as I could find in Cat's Cradle. Helpful lies, human connections, fate, and the state of nature. These are the primary interests of Bokonon, which he based his religion and government around. But although it wasn't repeated within the book as a clear focus of Bokononism, I would like to take a moment to discuss morality, since it's much subtler but still has an important place in this analysis. What pieces we are given of the books of Bokonon within Cat's Cradle have little to say about right and wrong, which I think actually says everything we need to know about the morality of Bokononism. One clue we get comes in chapter 93, through an interaction between our narrator and his recent fiancée Mona, who is the daughter of Papa Monzano and considered by all to be the most beautiful woman in San Lorenzo. When Jonah expresses to her that as his wife she will be expected to love him above anyone else, Mona condemns him as a sinwat, or a man who wants all of somebody's love, as she puts it. Love between all people is considered divine by Bokononists, but only ever in a very vague sense, and is never given any concrete moral value beyond good. According to Bokonon, loving each other is just good. Being a sinwat is just bad. Jonah has his own trouble reconciling the ideology of Bokononism. He asks Frank Honecker in chapter 94 what is sacred to Bokononists, since they don't seem to revere anything the way that a Christian would, not even God. Frank replies that there's only one thing which is sacred to a Bokononist, and that's man. Outside of these few insights, we're told virtually nothing explicit on the ethical beliefs of Bokononism. It might be tempting then to project our own societal views of right and wrong onto this religion by default, but the text instead shows us that this is an incorrect assumption. One might infer, for example, that a Bokononist would consider murder to be wrong because Bokononism advocates love between all people and takes much of its basis from Christianity, and because the reader thinks murder is wrong. But instead we're shown the hook, capital H, which stands in the center of San Lorenzo's capital. A giant metal hook upon which Bokononists are supposed to be publicly impaled and killed as punishment for practicing the religion illegally. Jonah assumes, and so does the audience, that the hook is just for show, and the death penalty is never actually applied for practicing Bokononism, since everyone on the island is a Bokononist. But no, Jonah is told, in fact, multiple islanders are murdered each year on the hook by the San Lorenzo government, all to maintain this illusion that Bokononism is illegal. This sort of government action shouldn't be able to exist in direct opposition to the nation's majority opinion, but since it's ingrained into the fabric of San Lorenzo's laws which were written in part by Bokonon himself, the people allow the action to continue freely and don't consider it to be wrong. If one wishes to apply the theory of ethical relativism to the culture of San Lorenzo, you could conclude that to them, murder isn't wrong. After all, Bokonon never wrote in his books that we shouldn't kill people, and to assume otherwise would be to falsely apply our own beliefs onto a completely different culture. So here we get down to the real question. How do we define the beliefs of Bokononism, this fictional theology that Vonnegut created from various world cultures, his own views on religion, and the greatest of Western philosophy? In order to argue Bokononism is far more than just a parody of organized religion, and in a way its own legitimate belief system, which I do intend to argue, I think we must first define it in terms of what philosophy we've already seen historically. And while Vonnegut makes much more obvious allusions to the likes of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, I think when we apply Bokononism to the theory of existentialism and the teachings of Jean-Paul Sartre, we really start to see what Bokonon and Vonnegut believe about the world. Existentialists believe that freedom is the greatest virtue, in fact the only true virtue there is, and advocate for individuals to free themselves from the pressures of society and instead choose their own actions and morals. Bokonon invoked this right to freedom by founding San Lorenzo in the first place, keeping the country isolated and relatively unknown to the outside world, and by establishing a moral code that goes against traditional societal expectations, as we've seen with Bokononists condoning lying in their religious text and murder via the hook. Sartre established existentialism as a philosophy of individuals and freedom in opposition to beliefs from thinkers like Hobbes that humans are savage in the state of nature and need the structure of society to become rational and moral, a sentiment which is clearly reflected in the books of Bokonon as well. Sartre was a strong opponent of capitalism on the basis that money and a society built solely around acquiring money restrict our personal freedoms, which echoes Bokonon's distaste for science as a tool to constrain society and stifle our individual nature. Another primary argument of existentialism is existence over essence, or the idea that humans exist physically before we have any moral or spiritual identity, and therefore it is up to the individual to create meaning or reason in their own life. Now, with that in mind, let's look at this quote from the books of Bokonon. In the beginning, God created the earth, and he looked upon it in his cosmic loneliness. And God said, "Let us make living creatures out of the mud, so the mud can see what we have done." And God created every living creature that now moveth, and one was man. Mud as man alone could speak. God leaned close as mud as man sat up, looked around, and spoke. Man blinked. "What is the purpose of all this?" he asked politely. "Everything must have a purpose?" asked God. "Certainly," said man. "Then I leave it to you to think of one for all of this," said God, and he went away. According to this Bokononist creation myth, we all fall into fate and God's plan, as we've previously established, but humankind is also granted the freedom to find meaning in that plan, to think of a purpose for all of this. God granted us existence from the mud, so now we must find the essence on our own. Sartre was an atheist, and much of his writings on existentialism reflect that, but he also proposes a different side to this theory, which he calls Christian existentialism. Christian existentialism is most often associated with philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. Some Kierkegaardian beliefs that line up remarkably well with Bokononism are the assertion that God and love are one and the same, and therefore our relationships are sacred, the beliefs that the universe is inherently paradoxical, and that we as humans can never know all of the answers, and the idea that God's plan and free will exist simultaneously, meaning that we can stray from God's plan given the choices that we make, but doing so will cause us extreme despair and dissatisfaction. It's interesting to see how Vonnegut, this self-proclaimed Christ-loving atheist, fits into the middle between the secular existentialism of Sartre and the Christian existentialism of Kierkegaard. Jean-Paul Sartre was born in 1905 and Kurt Vonnegut in 1922, making them contemporaries, so it's no surprise that Vonnegut's writings on religion managed to merge Christianity with both his free-thinking family legacy and the emerging philosophical theories of the era. Knowing that Bokononism has significant overlap with Christian existentialism definitely serves to contextualize the beliefs Vonnegut presents, but this doesn't change at all the fact that Bokononism was always legitimate, whether or not it aligned with a pre-existing philosophy. Ever the master of getting his point across, Vonnegut designed the books of Bokonon to be as strong a parallel to real religions as possible, making it an extremely successful parody, but also making it poignantly effective to the reader, much like a real scripture would be. For fans of Vonnegut's work, Bokononism contains all the same dark humor and absurd social commentary that draws people to his books in the first place, but this time with genuine messages of faith and love and freedom at its core. So it's no wonder people continue to find themselves drawn to Cat's Cradle and the teachings of Bokonon to this day. In 2018, a website was established by Eugene Wallingford, an associate professor at the University of Northern Iowa, titled The Books of Bokonon. On this site, Wallingford, a self-proclaimed Vonnegut enthusiast, tabulated all of the quotes within Cat's Cradle which are meant to be taken directly from the fictional Books of Bokonon, giving us a source that is the closest we can get to having the actual book ourselves as a Bokononist would have read it. We're not given much of the actual text, at least not compared to how long the entire Books of Bokonon would likely be if they existed. It's mostly just witty poems and definitions for Bokonon's made-up vocabulary words. On Eugene Wallingford's personal website, right below where he references his love for Vonnegut and his work on the Books of Bokonon website, he mentions that he's from Indiana and considers himself still a Hoosier at heart, which is a clever allusion to the most referenced Granfalloon we see in Cat's Cradle, that false cuirass that I mentioned earlier. Running across this little joke in my research is what really awakened me to the sheer influence of what Vonnegut has created here in Cat's Cradle. A parody religion from this short science fiction novel has changed the way that a professor in Indiana sees his own home state, and then changed the way that I see him, as I was left feeling like I'd shared some sort of inside joke with this man who I've never met. I found myself wondering if Wallingford would consider himself a Bokononist in any sense. Would I consider myself a Bokononist even, since I clearly have a lot of love for Cat's Cradle and all it has to say about the world? After all, finding a belief system that changes the way you see yourself, other people, and the world around you, isn't that what a real religion is supposed to do? Obviously, we're not Bokononists unless we consider ourselves to be, and I don't plan to run off to escape society on a remote Caribbean island anytime soon, but it is interesting to observe how the media we enjoy affects us. Kurt Vonnegut didn't intend to create an actual religion when writing Cat's Cradle. If he did, he would have just published the books of Bokonon themselves. But by injecting this fictional theology with equal parts Christian faith and atheistic existentialism, he shows us a worldview that resonates with many people who find themselves caught in between these opposing ideas, much like our narrator is, and much like Vonnegut was himself. For those who can't decide whether they want to live by the teachings of existentialism as humanism or the Holy Bible, Vonnegut seems to tell us this: choose freedom over society, have faith in the unknown, find your cuirass and love one another, and live by the harmless untruths that make life happy, because for all we know, that golden boat will sail again and the world will end tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Do you like my fake books of Bokonon? It's actually the complete works of Shakespeare. But it looks all old and spooky, so it works. Cats in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. I need to stop.